Still trickling. All right, welcome everyone. It's great to see y'all again. I think by now I don't need to introduce myself other than being Connor Ewing. Good to see you. Delighted as always to have another entry in our Kinder Colloquium series. As we get started, I'll just remind everyone of the basic Zoom etiquette that no one needs to be reminded of anymore. Mics on mute just in case. We'll open things up at the end for Q&A, which we very much look forward to. On this anniversary of Abraham Lincoln's birthday, I can think of only a small number of people whose reflections could appropriately mark the occasion, and Lucas Morel is one of those people. Dr. Morel is the John K. Boardman Jr. Professor of Politics and head of the Politics Department at Washington and Lee University. He holds a PhD in political science from Claremont Graduate University. He's authored or edited several books. I won't go through all of them. I'll just highlight a couple that might be of interest to those here. Lincoln and Liberty, Wisdom for the Ages, Lincoln's Sacred Efforts, Defining Religion's Role in American Self-Government. Particularly relevant to his talk today is the recently published Lincoln and the American Founding. Professor Morel is a trustee of the Supreme Court Historical Society, former president of the Abraham Lincoln Institute, and a consultant on the Library of Congress's exhibit on Lincoln and the Civil War, and was formerly a member of the Scholarly Board of Advisors for the Abraham Lincoln Bicentennial Commission. He is also currently serves on the U.S. Semi-Quincentennial, a word that I was sure I'd butcher, commission, which will plan activities to commemorate the founding of the United States of America. Many of those present this afternoon can relate to the fact that there are a couple areas of scholarship where the field is particularly crowded and it can be difficult to make a contribution. One of those is the American Founding. Another is Abraham Lincoln and the Civil War. Professor Morel has taken on both. And as we'll hear today, he's done so both successfully and impressively. The title of his talk is Lincoln, the Founding, and the Challenge of Self-Government. So please help me welcome Professor Lucas Morel.
Thank you, Professor Ewing, Professor Dyer, and all the folks at the Kinder Institute on Constitutional Democracy for the invitation to speak on one of my favorite days of the year, Lincoln Day. I hope that what I share about Lincoln's view of the Constitution, related constitutional questions like the relevance of the Declaration of Independence, the problem that race posed to a people long accustomed to slavery, and the challenges a free people face in maintaining a constitutional way of life will help us think through what our country requires of us today. If they had bumper stickers for the horse and buggy back in Lincoln's day, his carriage would say, "I heart the American Founding." In my book, Lincoln and the American Founding, I argued that there was no greater influence on Lincoln's statesmanship than the leading men, and especially the leading ideas or documents, if you will, that shaped America's revolution and its early constitutional formation. Now, you can't talk about the founding without talking about the, in my opinion, founder, and that means George Washington. So in my book, chapter 1, I start with the influence that Washington had on Lincoln, Washington's character, his piety, and his indispensable role as a conceiver and establisher of constitutional self-government in America. But for Lincoln, as I suggested earlier, more important than a founding man was a founding document, and that, of course, is the Declaration of Independence. On his way to his first inauguration as president, he said, "I have never had a feeling politically that did not spring from the sentiments embodied in the Declaration of Independence." So in chapter 2 of my book, it's the longest chapter, I explore how Lincoln was shaped by the key principles of the Declaration, and to some extent, its chief draftsman, Thomas Jefferson. After all, Thomas Jefferson was a Democrat. If the Declaration spells out the purpose or aim of the American regime, chapter 3 of my book focuses on the means of American self-government, and these are found in the United States Constitution. I examine why Lincoln preached what he called a reverence for the Constitution and laws, as well as the more perfect union of the American states that were established by the Constitution. Now, you can't read the Declaration and the Constitution and not notice that there's a few provisions of the Constitution that don't quite align, in fact, contradict the noble aims of the Declaration of Independence. And so in chapter 4, I turn to what Lincoln learned from the founding in terms of their compromises with slavery, the institution. He called it the great behemoth of danger, but the institution that contradicted the founding experiment in self-government. The final chapter of my book explains Lincoln's understanding of what we today call original intent as a political practice. In short, why follow the founders? So this chapter examines how Lincoln understood his own respect for the American founding in light of progress, experience, and the responsibility that each generation of Americans has to govern themselves under the Constitution, and as Lincoln would argue, in light of or informed by the principles of the Declaration. Lincoln believed that during his fractious times, looking back to the founding could actually help Americans move forward. He did this most famously in his Gettysburg Address. That speech begins at the nation's beginning, right? That famous odd opening 77 years ago. Our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. So if you do the math, you find that he takes his audience back not to the ratification or the drafting of the Constitution, and certainly not to the year 1619, but to the Declaration of Independence, not to the body, but if you will, to the soul of the nation. If America stood for anything, it was equality and liberty. So Lincoln goes on to explain in the Gettysburg Address that the Civil War was a test of America's purpose. As he put it, whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. So in the midst of a fight for the very survival of the United States, a civil war, Lincoln thought that the nation would benefit from looking to its past. The nation, Americans, needed a reminder of why holding on to the Union of American States was so important. So Lincoln thought to clarify, or he sought to clarify, November 19th, 1863, what was at stake. So Americans shooting not at a foreign enemy, but at each other. I think it's safe to say there was some confusion about what America meant, what the purpose of this country was for. What were its highest aims? What were its purposes? Lincoln hoped that Americans in the middle of this Civil War would recommit themselves, dedicate themselves to the task that remained, as he described it, to honor the dead who fought at Gettysburg on behalf of the Union by sustaining the effort to preserve the American Union. It was a fight to defend a certain political way of life, what Lincoln called government of the people, by the people, for the people. And we have to recall, and every time I teach my class, I remind them, slavery is never mentioned. Emancipation is never mentioned. But he delivered that speech in the year of what I call Jubilee, the year of emancipation, right? January 1, 1863. Union soldiers and sailors since that date were now charged by the President of the United States to protect the freedom, to secure liberty of over 3 million now legally freed Black people. What Lincoln called a new birth of freedom was directly tied to the old, original birth of freedom, our first Emancipation Proclamation, if you will, which was our Declaration of Independence. Its central idea, according to Lincoln, was that all men are created equal. And that described the natural condition of all human beings. So at Gettysburg, Lincoln did not announce a new principle of freedom, but affirmed an old one he learned from the founding fathers when they started this country. Lincoln never sought to discover new rights for a new age. He never spoke of a living constitution, one where a visionary few would discern what would benefit the many. Instead, Lincoln spoke of the unfinished work to which the living, all the American people, could dedicate themselves. In this way, they could honor, way beyond words, the men who fought and died At Gettysburg, those who here gave their lives that the nation might live. This was not a Civil War epiphany of Lincoln's. In February of 1861, as he headed to the nation's capital to be inaugurated as president, he stopped at the capital of New Jersey, Trenton. And there, hosted by the state Senate, he said, "I am exceedingly anxious that this union, the Constitution, and the liberties of the people shall be perpetuated in accordance with the original idea for which that struggle was made." Now, our temptation today is to think that everything new is by definition improved. It must be better. Why? Because it's new. But in Lincoln's time, there were some Americans arguing for something new, all right, an improvement on the American founders, which rejected what Lincoln considered the original idea behind American independence. What's an example of that? Think of Alexander Stephens of Georgia, a former Whig colleague of Lincoln's, and when Lincoln was in Congress in 1847 to 1849. As the vice president of the Confederate States of America, Alexander Stephens argued that their Constitution was better than the old one Lincoln was trying to preserve. Why was it better? Not simply because it protected slavery and did so explicitly, whereas the old Constitution never even mentioned the word. There were plenty of regimes throughout human history that had practiced slavery. So that's not new. That wasn't the improvement of the Confederation, the Confederacy. Stephens argued that the Confederacy was the first to base its slave society on a racial premise, white supremacy. There's your systematic racism, the Confederate States of America. Stephens said that the American founders believed that, quote, the enslavement of the African was in violation of the laws of nature, that it was wrong in principle, socially, morally, politically. However, he lauded the Confederate Constitution because it was, as he put it, founded on exactly the opposite idea. Its foundations are laid, he said. Its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man. Slavery is the subordination slavery's subordination to the superior race is his natural and normal condition. And he added that this, our new government, is the first in the history of the world, based upon this great physical, philosophical, and moral truth. So he argued that the anti-slavery principles of the founding, he says, quote, they were fundamentally wrong. They rested upon the assumption of the equality of races, end quote. This was something he considered an error. He called it a sandy foundation, unlike the new and improved Constitution that he helped draft for the Confederacy. Nevertheless, in the decade that led up to the Civil War, Lincoln's main political target was not Southern slave owners, but complacent white Northerners, especially those persuaded or open to persuasion by his Illinois rival, Senator Stephen Arnold Douglas. Lincoln criticized Douglas's notion of what he called popular sovereignty because it was neutral on the slave question. Douglas believed that whites at the local level, whether in the territories or in the states, that these whites had the right to decide the question without interference from Congress. In other words, whether slavery would expand or diminish in the United States under Douglas's definition of popular sovereignty would be determined not by a majority of all Americans, right? The direction that their whole country was going in, but by a very small minority of the settlers who went to live in the Western territories. In reference to the enslavement of Black people out West, this is what Douglas had to say. I don't care whether it be voted up or down, right? He was neutral. This indicated to Lincoln that the greatest obstacle to reducing slavery and eventually eliminating it in the United States was Stephen Douglas teaching not Southerners, but Northern whites to become indifferent to the plight of Blacks in the federal territories. This is how Lincoln put it. They tell us that they desire the people of a territory to vote slavery out or in as they please. The question arises, slavery or freedom? Caring nothing about it, they let it come in. And that is the end of it. It is the surest way of nationalizing the institution. Just as certain, but more dangerous because more insidious. But it is leading us there just as certainly and just as surely as Jeff Davis himself would have us go. So what made Douglas's don't care policy in the territory so insidious to Lincoln was that for slavery to become national, get this, no politician, north or south of the Mason-Dixon line, needed to actually argue in favor of slavery. Following Douglas, just get white Americans, especially in the North, not to care if Black slavery expanded into the federal territory. Once slavery was accepted as a constitutional right in that territory, which is where future states come from, it would soon be legal in the free states, regardless of what their laws or constitution said. In his debates with Douglas in 1858, Lincoln warned that popular sovereignty, understood this way, coupled with the 1857 Dred Scott opinion, would produce precisely this outcome in the not too distant future. By straying from its original commitment to human equality, America was becoming a country Lincoln could no longer recognize. And so he called upon what he referred to as our revolutionary fathers for aid. Looking back to the founders could not have been more relevant to the crisis the nation faced in the 1850s. And Lincoln wasn't the only one appealing to the fathers. Stephen Douglas, right, the leading Democrat and therefore the leading politician of the 1850s, he claimed that he knew better than Lincoln what the founders thought about the question of slavery. Douglas claimed that his policy of popular sovereignty aligned more closely with the founders' intentions for the new republic. In Lincoln's mind, the future of freedom and the eventual demise of slavery depended on whose interpretation of the founders was correct and could therefore best unite a divided country. Lincoln argued that at the founding of the United States, slavery was viewed and treated as a necessary evil. But it had become in the slaveholding states, to quote South Carolina Senator John C. Calhoun, a positive good. The founders also agreed, according to Lincoln, that where slavery already existed in the states, Congress would have no authority over the institution because of the federal nature of the political system, the federal constitution. Slavery was what was known at the time as a domestic or intra-state institution. So it was governed almost entirely by state authority. Since the beginning of the United States, the powers of government were divided between the state governments and the national government. Because slavery existed prior to the formation of the United States, it remained a state institution. And if the states themselves didn't abolish it, it could not be abolished by Congress short of a constitutional amendment followed by state ratification. With the population growing faster in the free states, the northern states, than in the slaveholding states, the future of slavery in America would be decided by the votes of white Northerners. Lincoln believed that Congress did have authority to ban slavery in the only land possessed by the American people at large, and that was the federal territories. However, tempted and invited by Stephen Douglas's notion of popular sovereignty, slavery's fate could very well be determined not by moral right, but by mere self-interest. And that just meant whoever could profit from taking Black slaves into the federal territories. But if white Northerners agreed with Douglas that Congress didn't have authority to regulate the domestic affairs in the territories, then his declared indifference, as Lincoln called it, his don't care policy, would actually represent what Lincoln called covert real zeal for the spread of slavery. And so Lincoln was at pains to tie the future security of the rights, even of white people, to the present insecurity of the rights of Black people. Those same white Americans would have to decide if what happened to people that did not look like them enslaved blacks in the South, potentially being taken into federal territory, had anything to do with the kind of country in which they wanted to live. For Lincoln, the necessary connection could be found not only in the thinking, but also the practice of the American founders. Case in point, when the Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed in 1854 and opened both those territories north of the 3630 parallel to the possibility of slavery, it contradicted the Missouri Compromise of 1820, which had banned slavery from that very territory. So that's been on the books for over 30 years. Lincoln pointed out that the founding generation, as well as the generations that followed in the early republic, acted to restrict the expansion of slavery in the United States. They didn't get rid of it right away, so they tried to prevent it from growing. They did so by banning slavery from the Northwest Territory in 1787, the only territory owned by the American people at that time, collectively. And then they stopped the importation of slaves in 1808, all in hopes of putting slavery, as Lincoln said, in the course of ultimate extinction. Lincoln lamented how the nation had departed, right? His generation had departed from its original approach to abolishing this pre-existing institution in a peaceful, gradual manner. And these are Lincoln's words. The plain, unmistakable spirit of that age towards slavery was hostility to the principle and toleration only by necessity. But now it is to be transformed into a sacred right. That's what Douglas called it. Nebraska brings it forth, places it on the high road to extension and perpetuity, little by little, but steadily, as man's march to the grave. We have been giving up the old for the new faith. The new faith was Stephen Douglas's perversion of true popular sovereignty. His was a crude majoritarianism that rejected the self-evident truth that all men are created equal and made the rights of Black people depend on the arbitrary will of local majority white populations. Lincoln rejected this. It was just rank legal positivism and preached a return. He preached a return to what he called our ancient faith, the faith of the fathers. Lincoln declared famously, "Our Republican's robe is soiled and trailed in the dust. Let us repurify it. Let us turn and wash it white in the spirit, if not the blood of the revolution. Let us turn slavery from its claims of moral right back upon its existing legal rights and its arguments of necessity. Let us return to the position our fathers gave it, and there let it rest in peace." Nice pun. Lincoln charged Americans to readopt the Declaration of Independence. In so doing, they would not only have saved the Union, but so saved it as to make it and to keep it forever worthy of the saving. That was October 1854. A country worthy of the saving needed to be a country, in Lincoln's mind, that limited the spread of slavery as the initial step towards its eventual demise. In short, a don't care policy was not worthy of Lincoln's generation of Americans because it was not worthy of the fathers of the American Republic. After Lincoln's election in December of 1860, President-elect Abraham Lincoln received a letter from none other than Alexander Stephens, who would soon become the vice president of the Confederacy. Stephens wanted Lincoln to give a speech prior to his inauguration, and that wasn't going to take place till March 4th. In Stephens' words, to save our common country. Quoting Proverbs 25, Stephens suggested to Lincoln that, quote, "a word fitly spoken by you now would be like apples of gold in pictures of silver." This prompted Lincoln to jot a note to himself, a reflection on what he called the philosophical cause of American prosperity. For someone who had long revered the Constitution and saw the union of the American states as essential to the success of Republican self-government, Lincoln wrote that even these, right, union and the Constitution, are not the primary cause of our great prosperity. So what was it? He said there is something back of these, entwining itself more closely about the human heart. That something is the principle of liberty to all, the principle that clears the path for all, gives hope to all, and by consequence, enterprise and industry to all. And then Lincoln, in this private note to himself, no one looking over his shoulder, he alluded to the proverb, Proverbs 25, that Stevens cited. And this is what he wrote. The assertion of that principle at that time was the word fitly spoken, which has proved an apple of gold to us. The Union and the Constitution are the picture of silver, subsequently framed around it. The picture was made not to conceal or destroy the apple, but to adorn and preserve it. The picture was made for the apple, not the apple for the picture. Therefore, what the country needed was not a new word from their new president. According to Lincoln, they already had the word or the words, those old words, the words of their forefathers expressed in the Declaration of Independence. Lincoln saw the Declaration's principle of liberty to all, right? Equality and individual rights. These were the moral compass of a constitution and a union that could otherwise be misinterpreted or even broken in pursuit of self-interested, even tyrannical ends. A year before he was elected president, Lincoln was asked to give a speech in Boston upon the anniversary of Thomas Jefferson's birth. He couldn't make the trip, but he sent a letter that was essentially an ode to Jefferson's achievement in drafting the Declaration of Independence. He wrote, quote, that the principles of Jefferson are the definitions and axioms of a free society, end quote. Now, for someone who studied Euclid's geometry, as Lincoln did while he was in Congress, Lincoln was referring to the Declaration's principles as the building blocks of democracy. Unfortunately, even self-evident truths can be denied and evaded, as was the case when Lincoln wrote that letter in 1859. Lincoln said, this is a world of compensations. He who would be no slave must consent to have no slave. And then he alluded to Jefferson's notes on the state of Virginia when he observed, those who deny freedom to others deserve it not for themselves, and under a just God cannot long retain it. These were astonishing words for Lincoln, the Republican, the former Whig, to utter, given the success that states' rights Democrats achieved in donning the mantle of Jefferson, one of the founders of the Democratic Party. But still, Lincoln declared all honor to Jefferson, to the man who, in the concrete pressure of a struggle for national independence by a single people, had the coolness, forecast, and capacity to introduce into a merely revolutionary document an abstract truth applicable to all men and all times, and so embalm it there that today and in all coming days, it shall be a rebuke and a stumbling block to the very harbingers of reappearing tyranny and oppression. In looking back to Jefferson, Lincoln looked back to a founding generation that put the principles of civil society and legitimate government in writing, principles he believed applied in his day, and obligated Americans to renew their commitment to eliminating slavery as fast as circumstances should permit. Now, how Lincoln approached the abolition of slavery owes much to his understanding of how the American founders approached the difficulty of ridding the new nation of slavery, as they sought to establish not just their political independence of Great Britain, but also a way of life based on the principle of human equality. This meant rule by consent of the governed, which for their situation meant rule under a federal constitution. Lincoln's anti-slavery convictions were the very thing that informed his devotion to the Constitution. Like the founders, he believed that but for the American Union, there would be no freedom for white people or Black people. This was no innovation on Lincoln's part, but rather an abiding conviction of Americans who knew their colonial and revolutionary history. Liberty on American soil required political independence from foreign powers. Independence required unity, unity among the American colonies and then states. To maintain that American union eventually required that compromises be made, especially and tragically regarding slavery. Lincoln said, I think that was the condition in which we found ourselves when we established this government. We had slavery among us. We could not get our Constitution unless we permitted them to remain in slavery. We could not secure the good we did secure if we grasped for more. And having by necessity submitted to that much, it does not destroy the principle that is the charter of our liberties. Time and again, Lincoln's references to the founders centered on how they tried to establish a government based on human equality, but by that very equality, imposed upon themselves a moral obligation, a necessity, that they abolish slavery in a manner consistent with the consent that, as I see it, is the flip side of the equality coin. Lincoln said late in the war, if slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong. I cannot remember when I did not so think and feel. And yet, I have never understood that the presidency conferred upon me an unrestricted right to act officially upon this judgment and feeling. This distinction between official duty and personal wish, a distinction Lincoln made most famously in his 1862 public letter to Horace Greeley before he issued the Emancipation Proclamation. That distinction, I think, demonstrates most clearly Lincoln's concern that Americans follow the rule of law in their pursuit of justice. With a draft of the Emancipation Proclamation in his back pocket, as it were, Lincoln wrote to Greeley this public letter, and he said, my paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union, and is not either to save or to destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. If I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. In America, the means of securing liberty needs to be consistent with the end. To emancipate slaves as president in a time of war, Lincoln had to turn a humanitarian end into a constitutional means. This way, emancipation wouldn't just be a righteous act, a humane act. It would be a just, a legitimately constitutional act of the federal government. And that is a legitimate expression of the consent of the American people. Lincoln made a correct view of the founding central to the nation's response to alternative interpretations promoted by influential figures such as Chief Justice Roger Taney and Senator Stephen Douglas. Unlike Lincoln, Taney and Douglas thought that the Declaration of Independence was true only for white people. They read it that way to protect the slaveholding founders from charges of hypocrisy. In the 1857 Dred Scott opinion, this is what the Chief Justice wrote. Taney wrote that the enslaved African race were not intended to be included, formed no part of the people who framed and adopted this declaration, for if the language, as understood in that day, would embrace them, the conduct of the distinguished men who framed the Declaration of Independence would have been utterly and flagrantly inconsistent with the principles they asserted. A year later, Stephen Douglas echoed this reading of the Declaration. He said if they included Negroes in that term, they were bound as conscientious men that day and that hour, not only to have abolished slavery throughout the land, but to have conferred political rights and privileges on the Negro and elevated him to an equality with the white man. The very fact that they did not shows that they did not understand the language they used to include any but the white race. That was Stephen Douglas. So to make profession and practice consistent at the American founding, thereby making the founders worthy of admiration by later generations, Tawney and Douglas interpreted the founders' profession in light of their practice. And if the founders didn't immediately free their slaves, they must not have seen Africans as created equal to the Englishmen or their descendants. So that was their argument. In Lincoln's response to the Dred Scott opinion, he commented on the equality principle stated in the Declaration. And he said on his reading, the founders, quote, did not mean to assert the obvious untruth that all were then actually enjoying that equality, nor yet that they were about to confer it immediately upon them. In fact, they had no power to confer such a boon. They meant simply to declare the right so that the enforcement of it might follow as fast as circumstances should permit, end quote. So Lincoln understood the founders not as hypocritical politicians, but as prudent revolutionaries. They recognized that circumstances like British opposition and long-standing prejudice and practice could impede their efforts, their attempt to secure these rights. Furthermore, Lincoln pointed out that their inaction regarding Black slaves in their midst was no different than their inaction toward white citizens in America. Here's Lincoln. They did not at once or ever afterwards actually place all white people on an equality with one another. They meant to set up a maxim, a standard maxim for free society, which could be familiar to all and revered by all, constantly looked to, constantly labored for, and thereby constantly spreading and deepening its influence and augmenting the happiness and value of life to all people of all colors everywhere. So put simply, the founding generation of Americans did not believe that they could both free themselves and free their slaves without hazarding the success of both their independence and their new way, their self-governing way of life. Lincoln's respect for the American founding, which established a new nation devoted to securing the blessings of liberty to ourselves and to our posterity, recognized both the noble end to which that nation was founded and the prudent means adopted to achieve that end. In looking to the founders, Lincoln believed Americans could find clarity about the true principles of self-government and thus find common ground for promoting a common future as a truly free self-governing people. I believe Lincoln belongs to the ages as a teacher of profound lessons regarding the challenge of living as a self-governing people. Lincoln became a statesman by looking to the founders and making the case that what they achieved was the most prudent and therefore the best means of securing their safety and happiness. Thank you.